First of all, in dealing with these lab test results, I find that Dr. Fowler's report gave sufficient notice to the state that the carbon monoxide that potentially was in George Floyd's blood, could have affected cause of death. I read page 15 of his report, which I don't have at my fingertips at this point, that basically they said Dr. Fowler came right out and said it should be tested. That gave the state notice with sufficient time in February to either test the samples that are still there or to dig a little deeper. It's just by serendipity that Dr. Baker calls the state and says, oh, by the way, it does exist. It should be in there. It seems to me very odd. I'm not claiming any bad faith on the state's part, but it seems odd that Hennepin County Medical Center, when they're asked to turn over all their records, that they don't include records that maybe are just buried a little deeper. I think their response to the subpoena was probably insufficient in and of itself. And they should check their standard operating procedures so that in the event this happens again, that they will supply all the information they have. But in any case, the defense gave notice that this was going to be an issue and specifically talked about testing the sample. The state had sufficient time to investigate and disclose to, even if it's just because Dr. Baker called the state and said, we can actually find this at 8 o'clock this morning, when the defense expert is done testifying, has left the state. It's untimely to give the notice, and it prejudiced the defense by the late disclosure, even if it's not due to bad faith. But the late disclosure has prejudiced the defense. It's not going to be allowed. So Dr. Tobin will not be allowed to testify as to those lab results. If there's anything he wished to add about carbon monoxide as far as environmental factors, but if he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial. Pure and simple. This late disclosure is not the way we should be operating here. In that case, Dr. Tobin may testify as to carbon monoxide if he sticks to the environmental factors. And as a pulmonologist, looking at the videos, for example, and seeing Mr. Floyd's location and not knowing whether the vehicle is even on or not, which the state brought out in cross-examination. All those factors he can talk about environmentally and what the likelihood is that it would affect his carbon monoxide concentration in Mr. Floyd's blood, that's fine. But nothing about these lab test results that were just disclosed 8 a.m. this morning after the defense expert is done. With regard to the DeMaio, I will allow I have a little concern that we're having a pulmonologist opine whether it's an enlarged heart or not. But given his background, which, as I think Mr. Blackwell appropriately stated, is a cardiopulmonary system, it is a system, and I think he has some expertise in the function of the heart and its relation to the lungs. And so I think it is appropriate that he be allowed to opine whether or not the heart was enlarged or not, based on those studies, and specifically responding to those studies. As far as the scientific research, the defense did bring up as a new issue whether or not narrowing of the hypopharynx is supported in literature, and Dr. Fowler said he did a check and he didn't find anything. I think it is permissible that Dr. Tobin be allowed to come and say, since then, since Dr. Fowler's testimony, he has done his own search, or he relied on this, and there is literature, and he can talk about the literature in a summary fashion. With regard to the hypoxic seizure, it was pretty clear from Dr. Tobin's testimony that he had an opinion that there were movements of George Floyd's legs, that those were myoclonic or anoxic seizures due to the lack of oxygen. Dr. Fowler did not really dispute that. He also indicated that it was a lack of oxygen to the brain that causes such seizures. The only difference between the two was the mechanism. Did the lack of oxygen, was that caused by positional asphyxia versus cardiac arrhythmia. And as I recall, Dr. Tobin excluded cardiac arrhythmia or a cardiac event as the cause of the lack of oxygen. Since he has excluded a cardiac event as the cause of the lack of oxygen, that evidence is already in the record. I don't have to remind both sides that the purpose of rebuttal evidence is not to restate what has already been testified to. It's to bring up new evidence to rebut something that came up in the other side's case. Accordingly, as to the hypoxic seizure, that's not going to be allowed. The scientific research supporting hypopharynx narrowing will be allowed. The lab tests are not allowed to be discussed, but Dr. Tobin can talk about carbon monoxide and the likelihood of a high carbon monoxide reading based on environmental factors if he wishes, because that was gone into a great extent. And finally, the reports, and he may opine whether, in his opinion, George Floyd's heart was enlarged or not. Do we have pretty much the ground rules set?
Just one question for clarification on the carbon monoxide. There were test results that existed before the ones that are at issue from last night / this morning. What Dr. Tobin, these are ones that relate to the oxygen saturation. So that was known before last night. And so I haven't talked to Dr. Tobin this morning about what he's going to say or when. I might ask the court for a few minutes before we start. But what he was able to come to last night without saying anything at all related to these test results at issue was we had the results already, both sides do, on the oxygen saturation in his blood from May 25th, 2020.
Well, let me ask you this. Is his opinion going to be that when the oxygen saturation levels are this high, that precludes high CO, because a high carbon monoxide reading would depress the saturated oxygen?
That's correct. They are would be inversely related. So a high oxygen saturation
would indicate a low carbon monoxide.
Yes.
Mr. Nelson?
As I understood Dr. Fowler's testimony, at lower levels of carbon monoxide, because the pulse oximeter it's not going to differentiate based on the color of the blood between oxygen and carbon monoxide.
This is the bright cherry red testimony.
Correct.
I think that's appropriate cross, but I think if that is in fact Dr. Tobin's opinion that these oxygen saturation readings, which have been disclosed earlier, would indicate a low carbon monoxide reading because they are inversely proportional, and it's appropriate, however, to say those readings are based on pulse ox, color of the blood, color of the fingernail, and the bright cherry red, essentially confronting him with that testimony, I think is appropriate cross, but it does not preclude the state from recalling Dr. Tobin for that purpose.
Yep, that's the clarification, Your Honor.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be permitted. All right, anything else before? And you want a few minutes to talk to Dr. Tobin?
If I may, Your Honor.
Why don't we start up at 10 o'clock? I assume he's close by. You could do it quickly, Mr. Blackwell.
I was hoping for a few more minutes.
I think since the defense is going to rest and you'll proceed directly to Dr. Tobin, are we calling anybody else?
No one else, Your Honor. And if we could have to 10:15.
10:15 it is.
All
All right,
thank you, Your Honor.
10:15 we'll reconvene. Thank you.